habitually convinced that greatness was measured in the glorious clang of steel and the dramatic flourish of a conquering hero, we prefer to excavate something quieter, far more mundane, and ultimately much funnier. We are not here for tales of dragons or miraculous sagas. We are charting the landscape of true medieval misery, the insidious weight of routine itself. The epic narratives have taken liberties with history, sanitizing what was often a profound, soul-wearying monotony. Imagine life structured not around moments of glorious action, but rather by the grinding certainty of elapsed time, the agonizing pace of chores that offered no deviation from the established, miserable rhythm. This is the reality we seek to document. Existence as overwhelming obligation. From the excruciatingly dull cycle of agricultural necessity to the relentless grind of social expectation, life moved at a glacial speed, marked only by mandatory participation and inevitable boredom. The day begins not with the trumpet blast of adventure, but with silence. A deep, oppressive quiet settles over the village, a hush broken only by the distant bleating of sheep and the sighing wind through dry stubble. Before us is the hearth, an empty black mouth waiting for fire that will inevitably be consumed by chores before it provides true comfort. The very air feels thick with patience, a dreadful, inescapable patience. Our story begins in this quiet vacuum, centering on a small, unremarkable dwelling where time does not flow, it merely pools. It clings to the rough-hewn timber and settles into the empty bowls. The early hours are dominated by ritualistic waiting, waiting for fire kindling that is slightly damp, waiting for the slow ache of hunger to peak before the inevitable, meager meal appears. This is life measured in degrees of anticipatory disappointment. Peasant woman, let us call her Agnes, sits near this unlit hearth. Her gaze doesn't roam, it simply fixes upon the cold bricks, a silent meditation on elapsed minutes. Her contemplation is not deep or philosophical, but rather practical. How much longer must she sit here? How many more breaths must she draw before the chore of hauling water from the well begins anew? The cycle dictates that one repetitive misery follows another. There is no dramatic interval. One task merely transitions into the next with brutal efficiency, leaving little room for imagination or deviation. It is a constant state of low-grade dissatisfaction. Every moment promises some semblance of nourishment, the smoke of cooking bread, the clatter of market goods, the murmur of distant celebration. And every moment delivers only the persistent reminder that nothing has changed. This tedium becomes the foundational pillar of their existence. As dawn gives way to a sickly yellow midday light, the rhythm accelerates slightly, not through joy or excitement, but through sheer necessity. The initial chores, gathering wood, churning butter, mending worn linens, are executed with practiced apathy. These are the duties that bind them together in a shared sphere of profound disinterest. There is no escape from the village routine. The entire landscape seems designed to promote maximum monotony. The meager patch of soil outside the cottage demands tending, even when the earth feels dry and unforgiving. The necessity of preparing for the eventual harvest looms like an unshakable, tedious god over all their actions. The hours stretch out, each one more indistinguishable than the last. They move through a landscape defined by waiting, waiting for water to be drawn from the communal well, where the bucket sounds too loud and singular in the quiet afternoon, waiting for neighborly gossip to provide momentary distraction, waiting simply for the harsh light to yield to the equally dull darkness of evening. These waits are not punctuated by dramatic events. They are stretched out into an unbearable continuum. The most compelling drama of medieval life is not the rebellion or the famine, but this sheer endurance test, the daily act of simply remaining in place and performing necessary functions with weary resignation. This early stage of existence establishes the core theme. That true struggle was often against time itself. Time was not a fleeting resource. It was an oversupply of unutilized moments, stretching out into hours where nothing happened except the occasional sigh or the dull scrape of a wooden implement against stone. The emptiness of the hearth is symbolic. It represents not just the lack of heat or food, but the gaping void in their emotional and temporal lives, filled only with the weight of obligation. The quietude of this chapter prepares us for the subsequent layers of misery, the mandated fun that follows, the infuriatingly slow legal disputes over paltry property, and the medical interventions that are equally tiresome in their utter lack of dramatic effect. Everything, every aspect of medieval life we examine seems fundamentally engineered to be profoundly underwhelming. It is a comedy written by necessity, starring people who have seen one too many empty bowls and endured one too many repetitive tasks. The true enemy of the peasant was not the Viking raider, but the relentless, unstoppable momentum of a perfectly structured, utterly meaningless day. If the relentless passage of time in our earlier chapters was an oppressive weight, this chapter finds us at the uncomfortable peak of mandated celebration. We have moved from the hollow silence of the unlit hearth to the clamor of a village festival, a cacophony that does not signal joy, but rather sheer exhaustion. The air itself feels thick with forced enthusiasm, and the scent of poorly managed roasted meats. This is merriment by obligation, a societal endurance test disguised as revelry. The great communal hall pulses with life, yet beneath the surface of dance and shouted songs, there is a profound despondency. Look at them, the assembled villagers, their faces painted with the forced brightness of participation. They move not out of joy, but out of an agonizing commitment to ritual. Their energy seems borrowed, a temporary expenditure against the crushing weight of routine existence, the focus shifts inexorably to the minstrels. These professional facilitators of festivity are our unwitting comedic tragedy. They burst into the hall with their lute strings pulled taut and their melodies excessively bright, attempting to whip up an atmosphere of unbridled abandon. Yet, their efforts only serve to highlight the sheer inertia of the crowd. Their songs describe tales of faraway lands, glorious conquests, or mythical heroes, epic narratives designed to distract from the immediate, crushing banality of turning another revolution of the wheel. But here, in this village hall, life remains stubbornly small and profoundly underwhelming. The dances themselves are where the true comedy of misery unfolds. They begin with an overzealous sequence of movements that require coordination and gusto. The peasant couples attempt to follow the complex rhythms dictated by the minstrels, but their steps are heavy, their movements punctuated by sighs, and the barely concealed desire to simply sit down in the corner and fade into oblivion. There is a lack of spontaneous joy. Every dip, every pivot feels mandatory, like attending a dental appointment you know nothing about. Consider the man near the center ring. He moves with a terrible, exaggerated athleticism, matching the minstrel's feverish tempo. Yet his eyes hold the flat look of someone counting seconds until they can retire to their meager straw mattress. His sweat drips down his brow, not from physical exertion, but perhaps from the sheer psychological strain of having to appear entertained. He is performing joy for an audience that seems primarily concerned with whether their ankle would survive another enforced twirl. The minstrels, in their professional commitment to exaggeration, escalate the situation. They introduce a complicated jig, requiring rapid shifts and complex footwork. One elderly woman, who has clearly survived many such mandatory merriments, attempts the steps, but falters midway through a particularly brisk beat, stumbling slightly into her neighbor. The resulting near tumble is met not with laughter, but with an immediate, polite flurry of apologies, followed by a collective sigh that suggests this embarrassing incident simply confirms everything they already knew. Life was cumbersome, and joy was exhausting. This enforced festivity serves as a perfect microcosm of medieval social engineering itself. The institution required people to feel something, joy, camaraderie, excitement, simply for the village structure to function smoothly. And just like poor sustenance or adequate plumbing, this emotion needed constant, burdensome maintenance. The narrative voice can focus on specific details to underscore the pervasive tedium. The way a basket of apples, brought out as part of the feast spread, sits there untouched on a linen cloth because no one has the energy for a proper fruit snack. The lingering smell of sour ale mixed with unwashed wool and desperation, even the moments intended for camaraderie, sharing a slightly overcooked pie, are handled with the mechanical motions of people performing an annual quota fulfillment. The miserable minstrels themselves are figures in this larger dark comedy. They are not merely entertainers, they are conduits for collective boredom, forcing the community to engage with manufactured rhythm. Their songs often pivot on themes of loyalty and seasonal cycle, narratives that, while beautiful in theory, feel profoundly hollow when delivered under the oppressive weight of 1,000 generations living life by the clockwork tick of subsistence. They sing of abundant harvest and boundless love, juxtaposing these high ideals against the visible reality: dirt floors, patched garments, and weary souls. We observe the contrasting reactions. Some villagers participate with practiced mechanical enthusiasm, knowing exactly how far they must feign enjoyment to satisfy their neighbors and masters. Others simply exist near the periphery, watching the spectacle unfold with an expression of anthropological disinterest. They are merely recording data. Another season, another exhausting requirement for collective happiness. The forced gaiety becomes a second layer of exhaustion, one that settles deep into the bones. The scene captures the quiet resistance inherent in boredom. It is not rebellion. It is simply non-engagement. It's the subtle head tilt that suggests profound disagreement with the key rhythm change. It is the way people cluster together for conversation, but only when they can whisper about something utterly mundane, thereby opting out of the spectacle's grand pronouncements. The culmination of this enforced merriment arrives not in a triumphant crescendo, but in an anticlimactic fade. The last song trails off, sputtering into silence. People do not rise to sing a final chorus. They simply start moving toward their dwellings with an audible collective limpness. They disperse like spent rainwater, each burdened by the residue of mandatory fun. The celebration has consumed its initial burst of energy and merely left behind a deeper sense of profound depletion. This chapter demonstrates that in the medieval worldview, even moments meant to elevate or distract were profoundly structured, exhausting acts. It suggests that more difficult and consuming than physical hardship was the sheer administrative effort of having to pretend you were having time fun. This mandated joy is revealed as just another grueling routine, leading us inevitably toward the hushed intimacy of unresolved conflict, where true suffering waits in the dust motes of a local law court. The weight of the manor wasn't carried by stone or muscle. It was carried on the backs of bureaucratic exhaustion. After surviving the mandated merriment, after enduring the slow burn of empty stomachs, life in the 14th century had achieved a level of profound, suffocating routine that modern sensibilities could barely comprehend. It was a boredom so total, it felt like a physical illness. And nowhere was this pervasive ennui more evident than in the muddy fields, where disputes arose not from passionate grievances or desperate survival, but from the sheer banality of ownership. Our stage for today is the dispute over nothing at all. A slightly overripe turnip. This humble root, lying half buried in a patch of communal earth near the boundary markers, became the focal point for an ordeal that would consume 3 agonizing hours and the collective will of several unsuspecting peasants. Law, we quickly learn, was not a brutal necessity, but a deeply convoluted pastime. The local manorial court, presided over by a bored bailiff who viewed jurisprudence as little more than a tedious scheduling exercise, gathered its usual suspects: farmers whose faces held the permanent pallor of low-grade disappointment and servants who regarded the proceedings with detached resignation. From the outset, it was clear that the true crime was not theft, but the accusation itself. 2 neighbors, Elias and Barnaby, stood separated by a nervous puddle, each convinced beyond reason that the other had slightly infringed upon their designated slice of muddy survival. The initial presentation of evidence involved much gesticulating over trampled mud and suspiciously similar patches of decaying foliage. They brought forth witnesses whose memories seemed to have been eroded by decades of monotonous hardship, who spoke in vague pronouncements about where it used to be or the approximate time. It was the kind of testimony that would make a bored academic weep with despair. Minutes bled away under the indifferent sun, punctuated only by the scratch of charcoal on parchment and the occasional cough of existential weariness. As the proceedings continued, the dispute escalated beyond the turnip itself. It moved from being about vegetable ownership to an investigation into whose shed was marginally closer to the stream, or whether a particularly robust patch of stinging nettles fell under the jurisdiction of either household. The lawmen, rather than seeking truth, seemed primarily interested in demonstrating the complexity of their own local ordinances, a display of procedural power that offered no actual comfort or resolution. They pulled out thick, musty scrolls and recited by rote sections of manorial common law dating back centuries. These laws governed everything from the proper method for hanging laundry to the acceptable distance between pig pens and cultivated fields. The sheer volume of this irrelevant statute was nearly enough to induce a coma in the listening parties. At one point, the focus shifted dramatically to the very nature of slightly overripe. Elias argued that the turnip's deep ochre skin signaled its passage into common domain. Barnaby countered with an almost scientific fervor, citing obscure seasonal bylaws regarding maturation cycles, and arguing that any discoloration was merely a natural variation indicative of peak ripeness, and thus his rightful harvest. The argument devolved from agricultural tenancy into a highly specialized debate on botanical semiotics, using terms like turgor pressure and pectin breakdown before the court even had adequate time to document such sophisticated peasant vocabulary. This exchange was staggering in its dramatic futility. We watched as reputations were staked not on one's ability to hunt or till the soil real skills of survival, but on one's ability to correctly cite subsection 3, paragraph B of an outdated agrarian code. Meanwhile, the sun seemed to track across the sky with painful deliberation, and the villagers continued to stare at their muddy boots as if they held the answers to humanity's greatest problems. The air hung thick with dust, stale sweat, and the metallic tang of pointless litigation. Every witness called was forced through an identical ritual of oath-taking, a gesture that seemed entirely unconvincing given the overwhelming apathy of the gathered crowd. They were performing the motions of justice without belief in its outcome. Even the poor bailiff looked visibly bored. His pen moved with a sluggish, practiced lethargy, as if documenting these proceedings was less an act of governmental authority and more required cardio exercise. The cumulative effect of hours spent debating the legal status of horticultural decay was profoundly draining. It taught us that sometimes the greatest threat to communal harmony is not famine or raiding bands, but the excessive dedication to maintaining pointless administrative structures. By sundown, the issue, the beloved, slightly overripe turnip, was settled, by all accounts, with inconclusive ambiguity. No one definitively owned it, and yet everyone left feeling that a profound injustice had been perpetrated simply for taking up time. As the villagers dispersed, carrying their unresolved grievances and the accumulated exhaustion of having participated in an entirely unnecessary show trial, they retreated into the inescapable rhythms of life, back to the repetitive chores, back to the mandated waiting, back to the dull certainty of tomorrow's inevitable routine. The turnip was forgotten, dissolved back into the earth, leaving behind only the faint but persistent residue of deep-seated intellectual boredom. If life was defined by monumental struggle, by the clash of steel, or the flight from plague, then perhaps medieval existence was simply a prolonged, agonizing study in banality. The grand narratives we romanticize, the sweeping sagas of heroism and rebellion, rarely touch the quiet corners where people merely tried to survive another miserable day. Consider, instead, the intimate details of their profound discomfort. We've seen that time itself was the primary antagonist, moving with the oppressive drag of a muddy river, punctuated only by mandatory toil. After all the grueling labor of the harvest and the exhausting charade of compulsory merriment, survival often reduced to managing low-grade existential dread. And nowhere is that boredom more potently manifested than in the practice of medicine. Imagine a time when an ailment, a simple twist of the ankle, a stomach ache brought on by stale porridge, or perhaps just the sheer fatigue of existing, was not treated with understanding science, but with utter guesswork and profound superstition. This was the age of questionable wisdom, where expertise meant the ability to mix enough potent filth into a liquid slurry to make you question all your life choices. The village apothecary, often little more than a curiosity merchant armed with dubious local knowledge, stood as the arbiter of physical misery. He did not dispense cure, he dispensed ritual and confidence. His shop, if one could call the clutter-laden hovel that, smelled less of herbs and more of damp wool and desperation. Every shelf groaned under the weight of dried things, brittle roots, unrecognizable insects, seeds harvested from unknown horrors. When sickness struck, dread quickly replaced despair. A fever meant a journey into the esoteric knowledge held by figures who often blurred the line between healer and charlatan. The remedies were theatrical in their absurdity. For a minor wound, you might be prescribed a poultice incorporating crushed beetles, ground bone, and possibly a whisper of venomous animal bile, ingredients that smelled strongly of decay and poor sanitation. The process was not about healing. It was about the spectacle of diagnosis. The doctor would employ an elaborate routine, feeling your pulse with misplaced gravitas, peering into your eyes as if divine secrets were etched upon your optic nerves, and then delivering a prognosis accompanied by a lecture that felt vaguely threatening and deeply nonsensical. The resulting cocktail was never palatable. It might be a thick decoction of fermented berries mixed with stale ale, garnished with strips of questionable meat, perhaps dog sinew, or the liver of some poorly identified woodland creature. These concoctions were sold not as medicine, but as an investment in hope, purchased by parents willing to risk their meager savings on the promise of feeling slightly less terrible tomorrow. The patient, defeated and utterly desperate, drank it down. The initial effects were invariably stomach churning, followed by a general malaise that suggested they had ingested several days' worth of refuse. Yet, because tradition demanded belief and poverty forbade alternatives, the treatment was accepted. One endured the nausea, hoping that the sheer weight of ancient ritual would somehow nudge the natural course of healing back onto track. This systematic failure of modern understanding presented a strange comfort in its predictability. There were no sudden cures, no miraculous pills. There was only the grim consistency of suffering, alleviated by more layers of complex misery. The diagnosis often led not to treatment, but to an escalating series of treatments, each one building upon the questionable success or spectacular failure of the last. Consider the psychological weight of this routine discomfort. If a simple cut required 3 days of dubious potions and nightly poultices, then chronic conditions became masterpieces of suffering. Life itself was treated as an endless, complex fever that required constant, exhausting management through rituals that were half believed, half performed for the sake of continuance. The medicine cabinet of medieval life was a perfect mirror to its social structure, highly elaborate deeply inefficient and predicated on the belief in unseen forces. The cure wasn't biological, it was spiritual or pseudo-spiritual, packaged and sold by men with impressive foreheads and dubious ethics. And so lived them, trapped not just by geography or harvest cycle, but by the very biological rhythms of discomfort. Every ache, every lingering cough became a low-stakes drama playing out against a backdrop of unrelenting, tedious struggle. This was life's core complaint, that nothing ever went away cleanly. The pain never vanished, it merely changed its costume, requiring another round of expensive, odorous mixtures to keep the slow march of discomfort going. It taught them, and perhaps us by proxy, that enduring a steady, low thrum of misery was far less dramatic and arguably more exhausting than falling victim to a sudden catastrophe. If the medieval existence was a comedy of misery, then nothing proved this more thoroughly than the agonizing wait. It wasn't the grand spectacle of battle or the sudden terror of famine that defined daily life. It was the slow, relentless grind toward an inevitable outcome, and that process often hinged on the presence, or rather, the frustrating absence, of a single person, the bailiff. The manor system demanded order, continuity, and crucially, resolution. But manorial justice, when mediated by a poorly paid administrator miles away, became nothing more than performance art in bureaucratic inertia. Our lives were structured around waiting for the bailie's decree. Waiting meant spending days near the outer edge of the village common, huddled under the indifferent gaze of passing livestock, exchanging nothing but weary glances with neighbors whose gossip was already wearing thin from lack of fresh scandal. The journey to the manor itself was a test of endurance, not against bandits, but against the sheer length of rutted earth road, which seemed designed by some bored god of logistics to maximize time spent traversing muddy patches and navigating unexpected ditches. To await justice meant embracing tedium as a philosophical state. You learned the topography of boredom, the specific ache in your lower back after standing too long on uneven ground, the way sunlight shifts across the same patchy field, offering no change, merely confirming continuance, the precise, hollow ring of silence that falls just before someone, inevitably, asks an irrelevantly personal question. The bailiff was not a figure of dread-filled epic villainy. He was far worse. He was profoundly mediocre. A man whose biggest crisis seemed to be deciding whether his horse needed shoeing, or simply a thorough, uninspired nap. His pronouncements were not delivered with the thunderous gravity expected of law, but with the weary, apologetic tone of a shopkeeper ringing up stale biscuits. To hear him read out the accumulated minutiae of minor grievances, the exact measurement of ground slacked in neighbor Bartholomew's yard, the disputed ownership of a patch of moss clinging to a fence post, was an exercise in intellectual deflation. We arrived carrying our litigations, armed with poorly corroborated testimony and breathless appeals to fairness. But the law here did not operate on merit or truth. It operated on procedure. It demanded 3 witnesses for a single turnip dispute, 2 sworn oaths regarding a slight encroachment, and the meticulous detailing of which specific hour the damage was allegedly done. The proceedings were an endless loop of repetitive questioning. And then what happened? They said you walked past. I maintain I did not walk past. An academic nightmare that bled into real life. Time itself became a sluggish, viscous entity. Hours dissolved into vague segments, punctuated only by the occasional scraping sound of a quill on parchment, or the monotonous shuffling of official sandals upon packed dirt. Our patience frayed like old rope left out in the damp winter fog. We realized that for these poor souls running the justice system, the inherent boredom was not an obstacle to their function. It was the function itself. Their mastery lay not in discerning truth, but in generating enough pointless administrative weight to make the petitioner simply give up. The consequence of this excruciating weight was a strange psychological resignation. You stopped expecting resolution and started merely monitoring the rhythm of stasis. You developed an almost supernatural ability to nap while sitting upright on a muddy bench, keeping one's wits about oneself in case the bailiff suddenly mentioned the scandalous misbehavior of someone who had already been declared legally dead. The most dramatic climax of these legal agonies was often simply another person falling asleep, followed by the slow, inevitable continuation of the debate. This pervasive sense of inertia did not only affect matters of law, it infected every aspect of communal life. The inability to move forward in a dispute bred an equally profound stagnation into neighborly relations. If you couldn't get justice for your garden boundary, perhaps you could perfect the art of mutual disappointment and sustained low-level antagonism instead. The bailiff's estate, this nexus of tedious power, was surrounded by other necessary evils. Records keepers who lived entirely off parchment dust, minor clerks whose primary talent was cross-referencing utterly unrelated property deeds, and constables more skilled at standing in a corner looking bored than they were at actual law enforcement. The system was designed to be maximally uninspiring. It wasn't tyranny, it was administrative redundancy. Sometimes, after weeks of fruitless attendance at manorial court, having established that the rightful owner of an empty patch of weeds was actually nobody, a brief moment of unexpected peace would descend. A stray lamb might wander into the courtyard, or a sudden, unseasonable drizzle might start to cool the overheated tension. These moments felt more monumental than any true legal victory. We learned that endurance wasn't about fighting injustice. It was about mastering the sublime art of simply existing through procedural purgatory. To survive the manorial court was to become deeply skilled in ignoring the obvious absurdity, accepting that sometimes resolution simply meant signing a document agreeing that nothing actually changed anyway. The great trauma of medieval life, therefore, was not death by sword or plague. It was slow attrition by paperwork and endless, utterly predictable waiting. If the scarcity of food defined life in the 14th century, then perhaps the scarcity of genuine private space defined the soul. In a village where every existence was lived within sight of its neighbor, true solitude was not a luxury, it was a radical impossibility. The fields might be vast and indifferent, but the village itself functioned as one massive, porous extension of the human ear, perpetually tuned to the low hum of unwanted knowledge. Life was cheap, yes, but privacy? Privacy cost more than a man could ever afford. The oppressive weight of proximity forced social interaction not by choice, but by simple physics. Where one lived, one breathed, ate, and soiled oneself in close relation to another. Every cough carried information. Every whispered complaint about the rain was immediately dissected for its economic implications or its personal scandal quotient. The very air seemed saturated with shared gossip, turning the mundane act of fetching water or collecting firewood into a public performance of one's domestic stability. This is the era of perpetual scrutiny. You could not simply retreat behind the curtain and consider your own internal state. The village viewed you as a collaborative exhibition piece. Your daughter's slight cough was scrutinized for signs of witchcraft. Your husband's delayed return measured against accusations of idleness or betrayal, and the way you folded your laundry was commented upon by those who claimed only superficial concern. The gossip that sustained this micro-community wasn't high drama. It was a grueling marathon of minutiae. It revolved around whose pig had wandered into whose ditch, whether Agnes's new shawl pattern suggested economic hardship or sudden fortune, and the bafflingly complex details of last year's manorial fare. These were not juicy whispers meant to incite immediate action. They were the steady drip feed of existential banality, designed solely to keep all parties equally anxious and utterly engaged in listening. The gossip keepers, the unofficial chroniclers of peasant woe, were masters of emotional stasis. They possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of every minor failing from birth, who coughed hardest during a fever, whose crop was disproportionately meager, which neighbor had dared to look at whom for a fraction too long at the manor's yearly harvest festival. To be perpetually watched and narrated by those you shared muddy paths with was a far deeper exhaustion than any physical labor. The body might collapse from hunger after working the fields, but the spirit withered slowly from the relentless, demanding requirement of maintaining an immaculate social front. You had to perform contentment even when your stores were low and your spirits were depleted. Imagine the effort required simply to appear normal. Every gesture had to be calibrated. A greeting could not be too cheerful, that suggested excess wealth or careless luck. It could not be too reserved, or one risked appearing aloof, therefore suspect. Everything was layered with a careful patina of manufactured indifference and performative mild concern. The village structure thus became its own most suffocating form of social engineering. The supposed thread of community support often revealed itself to be nothing more than a tightly woven net of mutual suspicion, an obligation to report perceived slights or deviations from the expected mediocrity. Solidarity was real only in the moment of shared misery, the time of sickness, crop failure, or manorial tax increase. And even then, those debts were immediately itemized and due for repayment. This constant surveillance did not foster genuine connection. It perfected a deep-seated cynicism and resignation. People learned to survive by compartmentalizing their emotional lives. They reserved real feelings for the darkness of one's own hearth, knowing that any visible outpouring would simply be catalogued, repeated, and used in conversation at the next communal well. The neighbors, therefore, were not characters, they were mirrors, reflecting back every weakness, every hesitation, and every poorly concealed secret. They magnified the triviality of existence until the sheer banality became a crushing psychological weight. The greatest threat to survival was rarely the hungry wolf or the harsh winter. It was often the judgment delivered over a misplaced bushel of dried peas. This scrutiny forced an internalization of misery. You began to monitor your own speech, your own facial expressions, not for personal integrity, but for their social cost. Did this complaint about the bailiff seem like mere whining? Or did it suggest a wider malaise that might impact my tax contribution? Was this argument over the boundary stone genuinely serious? Or would it simply mark me as an unproductive antagonist to the general flow of village routine? The pressure was ceaseless. There were no off hours for the heart. The moment you collapsed into sleep, your subconscious remained catalogued by those listening outside your window. And even in dreams, the gossip lingered, transforming restful slumber into merely a brief intermission before the next obligatory round of social observation. And so, life continued its slow, excruciating churn. From the mandatory feasting and the endless legal debates, it moved to the corrosive intimacy of knowing too much about one's neighbor's inadequate state of being. The medieval existence was not defined by glorious defiance or sweeping romance. It was defined by the unrelenting need to perform ordinariness, a deeply exhausting theater staged entirely for the benefit of 100 judging eyes who had simply nothing better to do. The agricultural rhythm, we are told, was a brutal cycle of perpetual obligation. It demanded everything from the peasant who lived on the razor's edge between survival and starvation. Nothing offered true reprieve, not even the meager exhaustion at night. For in fact, exhaustion merely fueled the next inevitable chore. The harvest itself, the pinnacle of medieval agrarian life, was supposed to be a triumphant affair, a period of glorious bounty following months of sweat and sacrifice. But for those who lived it, it was simply the ultimate grind, a marathon of mandatory labor, extending past the point where any worker could muster anything but sheer, desperate momentum. The fields became vast, unending landscapes of potential productivity, yet delivering only overwhelming monotony. The task, cutting grain, binding sheaves, hauling mountains of hay to a distant storehouse, was not an act of skilled craftsmanship. It was simply attrition. It was the repetitive motion of muscle fatigue turning into existential dread. One could spend days bent over ripe wheat, swinging scythes in predictable arcs, hearing only the monotonous rustle of stalks and the rhythmic groan of strained sinews. There is a profound comedy to this mandatory commitment to toil. The fields offered no imaginative escape. There was no mythical beast to fight, no rival village to conquer. There was only the crop, an endless commodity that demanded continuous attention until your hands blistered and your bones ached with the specific ache of overwork. The sheer scale of agricultural obligation meant that life's emotional bandwidth was completely consumed by logistics. Every thought, every moment of quiet contemplation had to be filtered through the lens of efficiency. How quickly could this stack be moved? When must I find another sheaf? How many more yards do I need to clear before sundown? If we define true boredom as a lack of stimulating engagement, then medieval harvest was its perfect negative counterpart. It was an overwhelming surplus of necessary, repetitive activity. The despair came not from idleness, but from the relentless requirement to perform industry. The sun beat down with merciless impartiality. Hours bled into one another, marked only by the gradual darkening of shadows and the increasing strain in the shoulders. Workers moved together as a slow-motion organism, a single, sprawling mechanism designed solely for biomass transfer. Some men joked. Their jokes were hollow things, punctuating the silence not with laughter, but with an anxious need to pass time. The harvest hangover is inescapable. By the time the last wagon was filled and the granaries were temporarily safe, a peculiar form of exhaustion settled over the community. It wasn't the satisfying tiredness that comes from cathartic effort. It was the deep, marrow-aching depletion that suggested the body had merely been tricked into believing it had earned rest. Consider the haymaking. The task requires not only strength, but an acute awareness of timing and leverage, knowing when a stack is structurally sound enough to move, or when a particular piece of forage needs bundling before rain descends. But even this technical requirement degrades under continuous stress. It becomes another endless sequence. Pitch hay onto the cart, stack it methodically, brace it, drag it across difficult terrain. The pattern was unbreakable, suffocating in its dependable routine. The village life had been constructed around these monumental seasonal peaks of labor. All social interactions, the gossip, the arguments over turnips, even the forced gaiety of a festival, were merely minor detours between the massive cycles of planting and harvesting. These small dramas were barely whispers against the roar of the combined effort that was sheer survival. And it was this dependence on relentless labor that proved its most exhausting facet. When life is defined by an external massive requirement, the necessity of feeding the community through another year's winter storage, then the individual spirit shrinks to accommodate the collective machine. Personal ambition stalls. Deep philosophical pondering becomes a luxury only afforded in death or upon starvation. The ultimate indignity was that this forced intensity never ended. Once the grain was safely stored, the labor didn't cease. It merely shifted its focus to preparation for the next cycle, repairing tools, clearing debris, mending broken fences. The rest felt provisional, always undermined by the distant, looming presence of the earth itself, demanding more effort. This agricultural overcommitment suggests that existence was fundamentally a job. There was no room for pure leisure, only the frantic scheduling around productive necessity. And in this deep, unending schedule, boredom wasn't a lack of activity. It was simply a gap between required tasks, a terrifying pocket of unassigned time where the sheer meaninglessness of the effort finally sunk its teeth into the soul. The peasant might manage to find fleeting moments of darkly comic despair, watching two neighbors struggle over a single length of rope, their sweat mixing with dirt in an absurd tableau, or staring out at a horizon that promised nothing but more identical fields stretching toward the inevitable next dawn. It was not simply misery. It was a structured, overwhelming ennui, woven into the very fabric of survival. And this persistent tedium, year after agonizing season, prepared them perfectly for the quiet collapse of emotional resistance, leaving them resigned to the endless, predictable cycle that defined their narrow world. If the manor was defined by agonizing boredom in its daily routines and the cruelty of endless waiting, then the family unit, the hearth itself, was where that monotony crystallized. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that descends when survival becomes an all-consuming background process, leaving nothing left for passion or spontaneity. The medieval home was not a sanctuary. It was an extension of the oppressive schedule, place where routine caregiving piled upon routine labor until genuine emotional reserve evaporated entirely. We have seen the agony of empty hearths, the banality of manorial court, and the sheer physical exhaustion of the harvest cycle. But now we are faced with the relentless, unsung misery of parenting in deep poverty. It is a performance that must be maintained daily, regardless of whether the props, food, clothing, fresh water, are available to sustain it. The child, initially seen as an extension of the family's meager resources and future labor, quickly becomes the unwitting mirror reflecting the parent's profound spiritual depletion. Raising a tired child when you yourself are running on fumes is not merely difficult, it is existentially draining. Every chore is performed with a residue of despair, every lullaby sung slightly too flatly from exhaustion. The pace of life, already agonizingly slow, grinds to an unnatural halt inside the four walls of the dwelling, punctuated only by the small, persistent needs of the next generation. Their existence demands attention, a focus that even the greatest boredom can exhaust. It requires the adult mind to constantly switch between surviving today's lack of food and fulfilling tomorrow's mandatory performance of normalcy. This dual strain is perhaps more debilitating than any single ordeal we have witnessed so far. The child, meanwhile, operates within this same vacuum of novelty and endless repetition. Their life is defined by the parameters set by necessity, following a fixed path to the stream, observing the predictable rhythms of the slow-to-gather livestock, repeating the play meant to occupy a quiet afternoon. But unlike the adults, who are burdened by the weight of maintaining systems, be they agricultural, legal, or domestic, the child's boredom manifests as an almost unpredictable energy. It is a restless need for stimulation that clashes violently with the monotonous reality of poverty. Their boundless curiosity is nothing more than a tiny, irritating challenge to the very concept of structured misery. They observe the ritualistic slowness of adult suffering. The mother who sighs too often when fetching water, the father who treats every conversation like another tiresome legal deposition, or the rhythmic thudding of tools that marks endless obligation. The parents are perpetually managing not just scarcity, but boredom, their own deep-seated ennui, which they must constantly filter and disguise for their offspring. They are attempting to transmit a sense of sustainable life through sheer will, making every gesture an act of desperate defiance against the void. But exhaustion is a potent disruptor of even the most diligently maintained routine. When the caregiving parents are themselves physically spent from the grueling cycles established by manorial law and harvest quotas, their emotional reserves hit rock bottom. They find themselves caught in a dreadful feedback loop. They are too tired to play, too tired to lecture, too depleted to simply be asterisk. The child senses this profound lack of resources, not just food, but psychic energy. And what is worse than hunger? It is the ache of unfulfilled curiosity when all the world seems bent on making you forget that your mind even exists. This brings us to a deeper understanding of peasant psychology. Enduring life was less about grit and more about radical emotional withdrawal. Every parent must cultivate this same exhausting level of resignation just to get through a single day, only to do so while simultaneously trying to foster a sense of vibrant hope in another human being who requires active engagement to survive the crushing weight of their environment. There are days, we know, when the simple tasks become Sisyphean efforts. Washing dirty linens until the fingers bleed becomes an absurd endurance test. Preparing the meager stew ingredients, meticulously peeling roots for food that barely nourishes, takes on an epic scope of pointless labor. It is all ritualizing despair. The child's play often mirrors this exhaustion. Their games are based not on grand adventure, but on simulating the inescapable mundane reality, chasing imaginary animals in circles around a patch of dry dirt, or repeating the same tiresome songs until they become mere vocal habits. The cycle traps them completely. They learn quickly that life has very few variables, and thus there is no escape from the pattern. And when both parents are caught up in their own circular movements, the neighbors gossip about who failed to properly separate manure, the dread of the bailiff's inevitable scrutiny, or the sheer muscle fatigue after hauling hay. They have little emotional bandwidth left for genuine interaction. The parental failure here is not one of neglect. It is a systemic failure of the human spirit under intolerable pressure. They are simply too tired of being miserable to actively participate in joy or even meaningful connection. We observe the silent communications between them, a shared, weary glance across the hearth when someone inevitably complains about the scarcity again. It speaks volumes of mutual understanding, a quiet acceptance that they are all equally trapped within this terrible, repeating cycle of survival. The child's occasional burst of innocent inquiry, a sudden question about why the sky is blue, or how one might get to a place where nothing is boring, is so startling in its naive demand for meaning that it sometimes feels like an accusation against the entire socioeconomic structure they inhabit. It forces the adults, who are too preoccupied with the practical logistics of mere existence, to confront the philosophical void. Why must life be this much waiting and this much tedium? The answer, often unspoken and rarely answered, was simply because that is what it was. And thus, the family becomes the ultimate battleground for boredom, where emotional expenditure fights a desperate war against the crushing weight of utter routine, leaving behind a profound residue of shared, beautiful misery. They are surviving not through heroic acts, but through sheer gravitational momentum, inching forward on the cushion of persistent despair. This domestic landscape is perhaps the darkest testament to medieval life, that even the deepest affection and the most most vital sense of belonging could be worn thin by nothing more potent than too much time and too little stimulation. It is a profound study in emotional atrophy, played out daily under the watchful eye of endless boredom, waiting for some distant, mythical rescue that seldom arrived. If the agrarian cycle defined physical exhaustion, then the pilgrimage was a spiritual tax. It wasn't about reaching sacred ground. It was about moving until you felt too tired to complain about the sheer pointlessness of it all. The village had endured the relentless beat of the harvest scythe and the exhausting surveillance of their neighbors, but nothing prepared them for the deliberate, enforced tedium of the holy processional route. This wasn't a journey fueled by genuine faith or wonder. It was mandatory movement, sanctioned by tradition and overseen by the ceaseless expectation of piety. Every step taken from the meager cluster of huts into the surrounding countryside felt less like devotion and more like participation in a carefully curated exercise in endurance. The purpose itself was often obscured by layers of devotional ritual, a convoluted mix of local superstition, saintly obligation, and ecclesiastical decree. Perhaps one needed to walk to appease a particularly irritable local river spirit, or perhaps one had merely been told that the yearly procession simply must happen, regardless of whether any souls actually required divine intervention. The participants moved in slow, deliberate columns, burdened by gear designed more for show than function. Baskets filled with indistinguishable offerings, oversized religious banners flapping uselessly in the lukewarm breeze, and the weight of anticipation, or perhaps resignation, hanging heavy over them. The initial hours were characterized by a sort of brittle, overblown enthusiasm. The local priest, vested in his finest robes, would declaim passages of scripture or historical piety with an almost exhausting gusto. His voice, amplified by sheer commitment, filled the crisp air, but to those walking alongside him, the peasant farmers, the women carrying meager water skins, the tired livestock that lumbered along dutifully, these words sounded thin and utterly divorced from the muck underfoot. The sermon felt less like divine guidance and more like a required attendance record for the soul. The true misery of the pilgrimage revealed itself not in moments of physical danger, but in its profound, creeping monotony. It was the hours spent traversing uneven dirt paths that wound through fields already scraped bare by the plow. The landscape offered no visual drama. It repeated itself endlessly, the same shade of dried mud, the same stubborn line of scrub brush, the same monotonous rhythm of walking footfall against earth. Each mile marker seemed designed not to guide towards salvation, but simply to quantify how much further misery was still required. Group would occasionally encounter sections of the route that involved mandatory kneeling or repetitive acts of pious contemplation, standing motionless for an eternity at a crossroads, while singing hymns whose verses were obscure and maddeningly abstract. They were taught to find profound meaning in these stasis points, but all anyone found was the uncomfortable stiffness setting into their knees and the mounting irritation with the slow pace. As the day wore on, the initial fervor drained away, replaced by a deep physical weariness that settled into the bones. The conversation faded into whispers of complaints not about danger or hunger, but about damp socks, the itchiness behind the earlobe, and the unbearable weight of carrying things that were probably meant to be at the destination. These small grievances became the true pillars holding up the day's existential dread. They were much more manageable than confronting the sheer emptiness of purpose. The air was thick with a mixture of sweat, wood smoke, and damp wool. The forced proximity of hundreds of strangers, some barely acquainted, some merely tolerated by geography, magnified every little discomfort. There was no escape from the shared failure to feel genuinely revived or elevated by the experience. Their journey became a collective testament to pointless effort. They walked for days, not because they were nearing spiritual enlightenment, but because abandoning the route would have meant admitting defeat to tradition itself. Passing through small hamlets along the way added no flash of color or respite. These roadside settlements served only as momentary staging grounds, a chance to refill water skins and acquire more stale bread before resuming the agonizing trek. The village structure repeated its theme: functional necessity dictated by crushing predictability. Life was structured not around major life events, but around perpetual maintenance. The climax of this mandated movement was always anticlimactic. Upon finally arriving at the supposed site of sacred importance, a crumbling shrine, a barely noticeable altar in an overgrown corner, the energy did not lift. It merely deflated. The ceremony that followed was excruciatingly long, involving petitions made to statues whose paint had flaked away centuries ago. Prayers were repeated until throats were raw, and vows were sworn over dubious relics whose actual historical provenance was questionable at best. The sheer point of the pilgrimage became horribly clear in that final moment. The true ordeal wasn't reaching the destination. It was the relentless expenditure of energy to prove you had endured the journey. The villagers learned a cold, hard lesson about medieval life's deepest boredom. Survival required transforming an inherent lack of purpose into a highly visible, physically exhausting performance. Every tired step they took, every drawn-out chant they repeated, served merely as proof that they hadn't quit. And proving nothing at all was perhaps the most profoundly miserable obligation of them all. The memory carried back to the manor was not one of spiritual revitalization, but of muscle ache and deep, weary skepticism. They had successfully completed another mandated cycle, another demonstration that life, even when draped in sacred ritual, remained thoroughly, undeniably tedious. The day's endless cycle of mandated misery finally reaches its inevitable conclusion. As the sun, having overseen another rotation of required labor and pointless social obligation, begins its slow descent behind the oppressive tree line, a fragile quiet descends upon the village. This is not the profound, restful silence of peace, but something far more brittle, the hush of complete exhaustion. Every muscle aches with the accumulated fatigue of repetitive movement from the fields to the crowded market square. And now it settles into the bones like cold ash. The final vestiges of the manor day bleed away in the smoke, rising lazily from chimneys, each wisp carrying the scent of stale wood smoke and resigned sweat. There is nowhere left to run, no corner where one can hide from the creeping weight of existence. Every individual returns to their dwelling unit, be it a cramped cottage or a communal sleeping space, carrying not mere tiredness, but the monumental baggage of having successfully completed another day in this elaborate comedy of endurance. The performance required simply to live had been utterly draining. It was an exhaustion unlike any modern fatigue. It was an existential depletion, born from the sheer effort of maintaining social semblance and adherence to an unchanging routine. We have traversed the agonizing slow crawl of village law, endured the forced merriment of pointless dances, submitted to the inscrutable wisdom of beetle-laced poultices, and survived the ceaseless pressure of neighborly judgment. The sustained misery, therefore, did not climax in a dramatic collapse, but rather settled into an overwhelming, almost deceptive quiet. In the heart of this forced tranquility, the final battle is fought not against famine or invading armies, but simply against staying awake, against the inertia of repetitive existence itself. Children finally drop onto their straw bedding with heavy thuds, sprawled out like spent dolls. Adults collapse onto shared pallets, limbs tangled in the weary geography of proximity. There are no heroic snores here, only deep, shuddering breaths that mark the end of duty. The bedtime ritual is not restorative, it is a surrender. The scraping of wooden beds together echoes faintly against the packed earth floor, each sound announcing another soul giving up the fight for active participation. Faces, scrubbed raw by endless activity and emotional labor, are finally turned toward the pillow, seeking the momentary void between one pointless waking moment and the next. The sleep itself is often described with a morbid fondness. It is framed not as a sweet escape, but as a necessary temporal intermission, a scheduled pause in the never-ending reel of tedium. The deep slumber that claims them feels less like healing and more like temporary erasure. They are shutting out the immediate world, the gossip waiting to be exchanged at dawn, the minor land dispute simmering over the rye patch, the unsettling familiarity of a mandated ritual performance when the appointed time arrives again. In this communal collapse into unnatural peace, the weight of historical routine becomes palpable. Every person is suspended in the deep gravity of mere continuation. They have survived another day without being seized by disease, arrested for minor misconduct, or simply overwhelmed by the banality of it all. And that survival, this absolute immunity to true drama, is perhaps the most profound exhaustion of all. The hours stretch, not into blissful oblivion, but into the deep pocket of pre-dawn monotony. Even sleep requires a certain level of low-grade anxiety. The worry about what arbitrary chore will define tomorrow, which neighbor's whispered judgment might pierce the fragile quietude, or which unexplained medicinal regimen must be followed to avoid outright physical collapse. This underlying hum of necessary dread keeps them tethered to the routine, preventing true rest. It is a paradoxical comfort, really. The misery settles into a predictable rhythm. You know when the hunger pangs will hit, when the dull weight of mandated labor will return with the sun, and how the gossip cycle will recommence by the first flickers of torchlight. This predictability, however grating, offers a thin veneer of psychological safety. It is an agonizing reliability. Life was structured not around thrilling peaks and dramatic troughs, but around a relentless, predictable, moderately unpleasant wave. The darkness descends, thick and smelling faintly of unwashed bodies and damp earth. The lords and ladies might dream of hunting parties or grand feasts, but for the common man, under the crushing canopy of the medieval night, the dreams are likely filled with counting sheep, or simply repeating innocuous procedural phrases. Who moved first? What is the precise demarcation line between this moss patch and that one? The great narrative arc of existence here was not defined by revolution or romance. It was defined by the meticulous accumulation of unremarkable seconds, the dull thud of a hammer, the rhythmic scrape of a sickle against dried stalk, the whisper of an accusation in the dark. To be alive was to participate in this unending, structurally enforced boredom. And as they finally drift into that deep, unchallenging slumber, it is clear that for them, respite was not the glorious void of death,